Niko Bellic sat alone in the empty airport, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning and the soft buzz of the overhead lights. It was late at night, the darkness outside casting a sense of foreboding over the otherwise sterile environment. As he walked through the deserted terminal, his footsteps echoed off the tiled floors, a stark reminder of his solitude. But then, as he turned a corner, he stumbled across a figure that made his blood run cold. Darko Bursic, once a trusted friend and now a traitor, was tied up and kneeling on the ground. Niko's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, his anger and betrayal bubbling to the surface. He pointed the gun at Darko, his finger tightening on the trigger. Darko looked up at him, resignation in his eyes. He was ready to pay for his sins, to face the consequences of his actions. But then, in a surprising turn of events, Niko's anger seemed to dissipate. With a frustrated growl, he threw his gun away and told Darko to leave him alone, never to come after him again. Darko looked stunned, unsure of what to do. Niko turned and walked away, leaving Darko behind, still handcuffed and helpless. He didn't look back as he made his way to the bike parked outside the airport. Riding through the dark streets of the city, Niko finally arrived at his apartment. The room was filled with smoke, a haze that hung in the air like a shroud. He sat down on a spare sofa, his arms resting heavily on the armrests. His mind was in turmoil, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He felt a heaviness in his chest, a weight that seemed to press down on him, making it hard to breathe. As he sat there, staring blankly at the floor, he suddenly saw Luna from the animated show Helluva Boss sleeping on the bed beside him. She stirred and woke up, her gaze meeting his. "What happened, Niko?" she asked, her voice low and calm. Niko sighed heavily, his voice tinged with sadness. "The whole world seems to misunderstand me. I can't stand it any longer." Luna sighed in response, her expression sympathetic. "That's just unfair," she said softly. Niko nodded, his eyes drifting back to the swirling smoke in the room. "I just don't know why." They lapsed into a heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Luna eventually closed her eyes and fell back asleep, leaving Niko to his own devices. He continued to sit on the sofa, his body still and unmoving, except for the slight rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, the burden of his past weighing him down. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he closed his eyes, falling into a fitful sleep. Through the night, he remained motionless on the sofa, his mind plagued by dreams of betrayal and redemption. And as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of his apartment, Niko Bellic slept on, lost in a troubled slumber. Words. 531. Niko Bellic stood alone in the empty, air-conditioned airport, the bright lights illuminating the otherwise desolate space. It was nighttime, and the silence was deafening. As he walked through the terminal, he stumbled across Darko Bursic, a former associate who had betrayed him in the past. Darko was now tied up and suffering from a severe drug addiction, kneeling on the ground before Niko. Niko pointed his gun at Darko, anger and betrayal coursing through him. He wanted revenge for Darko's treachery, to make him pay for his actions. But as Darko looked up at him, accepting his fate, Niko hesitated. He couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. Throwing his gun aside, Niko told Darko to leave him alone and never come after him again. With a heavy heart, he turned and walked away, leaving Darko handcuffed and alone in the empty airport. Outside, Niko found a bike parked near the entrance and decided to ride it back to his apartment. The cool night air rushed past him as he made his way through the city streets, the hum of the engine providing a sense of peace amidst the chaos of his thoughts. Arriving at his apartment, Niko entered the smoke-filled room and sank down onto a spare sofa. His arms rested on the armrests, and he stared blankly at the floor, lost in his own thoughts. Feeling the weight of his past sins and the burden of his actions, Niko fell into a deep depression. He sat motionless on the sofa, his gaze fixed on the smoke swirling around the room. The sound of his own breathing filled the silence, echoing in the empty space. Suddenly, he saw Luna from the animated show Helluva Boss sleeping in the bed beside the sofa. She awoke and gazed at Niko with concern, asking him what was wrong. Niko spoke in a heavy, depressed voice, expressing his frustration with the world and the misunderstandings he faced. Luna listened quietly, her own calm voice offering sympathy and understanding. As the night wore on, Niko remained sitting on the sofa, staring at the smoke and lost in his thoughts. Luna, too, fell back asleep, leaving Niko to his own devices. Closing his eyes, Niko finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling asleep while sitting on the sofa. His body remained still, his breath steady, as he drifted off into a restless slumber. The night passed slowly, the darkness enveloping Niko as he slept, his mind troubled by the events of the past and the uncertainties of the future. And as the first light of dawn began to filter into the room, Niko stirred, awaking to a new day filled with the same old struggles and the same old demons. But for now, in this moment of quiet solitude, he found a brief respite from the chaos of his life. Words. 474. Niko Bellic stood alone in the deserted, air-conditioned airport, the harsh lights casting long shadows across the empty space. It was night, the only sound the hum of the air conditioning. As he walked through the silent airport, he stumbled upon a figure tied up and kneeling on the ground. It was Darko Bursic, the man who had betrayed him in the past and left him scarred both physically and emotionally. Niko pointed his gun at Darko, his eyes burning with anger and betrayal. Darko, now suffering from the effects of drug addiction, bowed his head in acceptance of his fate. But just as Niko was about to pull the trigger, he stopped himself. He couldn't bring himself to take another life, no matter how much pain Darko had caused him. With a heavy heart, Niko threw his gun aside and told Darko to leave him alone and never come after him again. Darko, stunned by Niko's sudden change of heart, nodded in agreement. Niko turned and walked away, leaving Darko handcuffed and alone in the empty airport. Outside, Niko found a bike parked near the entrance. He climbed on and rode through the dark streets of the city, the cool night air whipping against his face. Eventually, he arrived at his apartment, a smoke-filled room that reeked of stale cigarettes and loneliness. Niko entered the room and sat on a spare sofa, his arms resting on the armrests. He stared blankly at the floor, lost in his own thoughts. He felt the weight of all his past sins and regrets pressing down on him, suffocating him with guilt. Suddenly, he saw a figure in the bed beside the sofa. It was Luna, a character from the animated show Helluva Boss. She was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to Niko's inner turmoil. For a moment, Niko felt a sense of calm wash over him. But then Luna woke up and looked at him with concern in her eyes. "What happened, Niko?" she asked in a low, calm voice. Niko sighed heavily, his voice tinged with sadness. "The whole world seems to misunderstand me," he muttered. "I can't stand it any longer." Luna offered him a sympathetic look, her own eyes filled with understanding. "That's just unfair," she said softly. Niko fell silent, his gaze fixed on the smoke swirling through the room. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise of the world and find some inner peace. The weight of his past mistakes hung heavy on his shoulders, but in that moment, he found a sliver of solace. As the night wore on, Niko remained motionless on the sofa, his eyes closed in sleep. Luna watched over him, a silent guardian in the darkness. And in that moment, Niko felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption and peace in a world full of chaos and betrayal. Words. 483.